Alright, what is up? My name is Zane Price here, and today we're going to be doing a review of a movie. This will be my first review of a movie, and the one that I want to start out with is The Last Jedi, which is a movie that has been kind of conflicted between not only fans of Star Wars, but fans of movies in general and the general public itself. My first take on this movie when I saw it was it's a movie that has a lot of problems, but it's a movie that I think, buried beneath a few things, is well worth your time to go and see. I think it's a very competent film before it's a very competent Star Wars film. It's definitely a Star Wars film. It has all the elements of Star Wars film. It deals with all the same values that Star Wars films tend to deal with. But it strives to separate itself from the Star Wars canon of 4, 5, and 6, episodes 4, 5, and 6. And it attempts to do its own thing, which is admirable, compared to episode 7, which Disney played it safe, J.J. Abrams played it safe, just to kind of reassure everybody that this won't be like the prequels, where it's all over the place, and you don't know what you're exactly getting. With this one, you kind of get a whole experience. Okay, at the end of this movie, you feel that characters have changed, you've learned something, you somewhat know the direction of where they're going to go for the conclusion of this part of the trilogy, episode 9. And overall, it's a movie that I can see why people not only don't like it, but really don't like it, saying it's on par with the prequels in terms of, its direction, in terms of its actual filmmaking. I think it's right up there with some of the best that the Star Wars canon has to offer. And mainly, that is the work of 3 people within this movie. It is Daisy Ridley as Rey, it is Adam Driver as Kylo Ren, and it is Mark Hamill as Luke Skywalker. When these 3 are on the screen, whether together or separated, they're electric on the screen. They really are the glue that holds this movie together. And the director and writer, Rian Johnson, who took over the Star Wars to finish this trilogy, especially with episode 8 after J.J. Abrams did episode 7, I think what he saw in these 3 characters is something that he didn't see maybe in some of the other characters, and we'll get to them. But he definitely saw an arc that could be made with these 3 characters, and it's really an interesting concept that he goes for here. It deals with, yes, some of the stuff from what I guess is this movie's parent movie, which is The Empire Strikes Back. It does resemble it in a few ways, but it is its own thing. And this triangle that is happening between Hamill and Ridley and Driver is what carries this movie. It's why I think Rian Johnson wanted to make this film. And when these 3 aren't on screen, the movie suffers. And it doesn't suffer entirely, it doesn't fall apart completely, but there's definitely a fall off. And that's a testament to how good these guys are in this film. And that's really the part of this film that I can say is on par with George Lucas's films, the original 3 trilogy. Because it is wonderful to kind of see the twists that these characters go on and see their motivations. And their motivations aren't always on a level playing field, and they're not always on the same eyesight, but they work through it, and we get to, at the conclusion of this movie, we get to a point where we see all 3 of these characters and we can tell, okay, this is how they've changed from the start of the movie up until the finale of the movie. And I think that's what carries this movie. The other 3 characters here that I think do their part in making this movie reputable, a good movie. They help add on to what's really the powerhouse of Hamill, Ridley, and Driver, is Carrie Fisher as Princess Leia, obviously, Oscar Isaac as Poe Dameron, and then a really interesting performance from Laura Dern as Vice Admiral Hodo. They're really... I thought this plot point with Poe Dameron kind of learning his way, learning that he can't solve everything by himself, I thought it was going to take a completely different direction. and yet it's the direction that they choose, the direction that Rian Johnson chooses to take this character on, is wonderful. It's well worth the time that it is put into his character. And by the end of the movie, all three of these characters had maybe not as nicely tied of a conclusion as the big three that I've been talking about, but definitely character development. And that right there, those elements, those characters right there, are really what are holding together what, in all honesty, is kind of a bit of a mess of a film. The film, especially in its opening scene, its opening act, really, is surprisingly weak. And I can almost attest that, maybe not attest, I can almost let that one go for Rian Johnson because we are transitioning between two completely different directors. J.J. Abrams played Episode VII as kind of this lighthearted movie. It didn't, nothing all too serious happened, with the obvious exception of, the shock moment of that movie. We were learning about characters. It was a good time to laugh. And the first 20 to 30 minutes of this movie, of The Last Jedi, feels like Rian Johnson is almost trying to continue what J.J. Abrams did with The Force Awakens. He's trying to keep that, it's the lighthearted affair. We're fighting against the bad guys, but it's not that big of a deal. And it just doesn't fit the rest of the movie. The first 20 to 30 minutes of this movie are not indicative of what the rest of the movie gives you, which is good, because the first 20 to 30 minutes of this movie are fairly poor. And I got worried pretty fast. But what I think drives this movie, and I think the biggest pro of this movie is Rian Johnson's direction within this film and his grasp on what he wrote when he wrote this script, because it is maybe not a darker take, but definitely a more interesting, it's a script that you have to work harder to get the most out of. The dialogue isn't given to you completely. There's a lot of acting, especially for a Star Wars film, done through countenance and through motion and through action. There's multiple action scenes within this movie where you look at them and it's more than just two guys with a lightsaber, or it's more than a blaster versus a guy with a little laser thing. It's more than that. So that part right there, Rian Johnson's direction, I want to make this movie firm, I want to make this movie poignant. I have three characters that I really, really love. I have a really good story arc for all three of them. I'm going to make a movie that borders on being kind of slow. If you take the parts which I believe Rian Johnson intended, I think there's about an hour of this film that Rian Johnson specifically, before he even went into production on this movie, specifically knew that he wanted to make. If you just took out that hour, I think you have one of the best Star Wars films, if not up there with The Empire Strikes Back as the best Star Wars film. But I think what happened here, and why it's such a mess, it's such a scattered movie, is I think Disney got its hand on this a little. Not to say that Disney's this corporate monster. Disney makes good movies, but there's definitely the imprint of a Disney production on this film, and I can almost explain that maybe. The Force Awakens made a lot of money, and it was a retelling of the original story of the Episode 4, and it made a lot of money. It was lighthearted. It got the kids and the adults and the Star Wars fans and the general public to go and see it. And then there was Rogue One. Rogue One came out the following winter. It was a darker movie. It was a more action-packed movie. It was not as good as a movie. And it reflected that in the box office. Disney did not make as big as a profit as they made on Force Awakens with Rogue One, and I think that kind of scared him off from Rian Johnson's vision with this movie. Because the worst part about this movie, is the tone. There are scenes between Adam Driver and Daisy Ridley, between Andy Serkis, who plays Snoke in this movie, who's the overarching bad guy. They're great because they're talking about what's good, what's right. Should we look to the past? Should we look to the future? But then we have the opening scene where Oscar Isaac is talking to Domhnall Gleeson, and it throws in a "your mama" joke. He's like, "I'm calling for your mother." You don't need that. And it's scattered throughout this entire movie. The worst culprit in the entire movie, and I haven't mentioned his name yet, because he was in episode 7, but he was fairly bad in this movie, is John Boyega as Finn, and then Kelly Marie Tran as Rose Tico. Their entire plot, their entire subplot, is maybe not useless to the story, although in the end, the actions they do are useless. It is just it takes you so far away from the other storylines that are going on that it's almost like you're watching a completely different movie. And I'm trying to make this as spoiler free as possible. There's a callback at the end, and a lot of people, there's a callback to the scene with Finn and Rose that at the very end of the movie that people are like, oh, that's why they went there. That's why they went to this spot that takes them completely away from the rest of the movie. I don't think that is the intention they were going for. Those two characters, John Boyega's character and Kelly Marie Tran's character, are pointless to this film. And it's not completely their fault either, because throughout this entire movie, one-liners and antics and laughs and spots where it could have been serious, spots where in your heart you're thinking, alright, I want some sort of emotional payoff, is just replaced with a quick one-liner from Finn after he kills off a character in the film. I don't know why that's necessary. And let me make this clear as well, is the stuff that Rian Johnson was going for, the serious stuff, that's not always on its game either. I'm trying to kind of explain some of the messier parts about this movie by saying, there's probably some outside person from the Disney Corporation saying, alright, you need to add some more lighter elements. You can't make a completely gritty movie. Even some of the grittier stuff is not always on point with Rian Johnson in this movie. But the good, all this talk, the good stuff in this movie, I've come to believe outweighs the bad stuff. Is it a bit of a drag in the first act? Yeah. Does it also, though, give you some of the best 15-20 minutes of any Star Wars film in the beginning of its third act? I think it does. The beginning of this third act is absolutely wonderful. There's twists in this movie that make this movie more than what I think a lot of people were maybe not wanting, or maybe not hoping for, but kind of expecting. And then to see those not take place, I think is what is having people get a little riled up. I think people feel a little betrayed because this movie is its own thing. This movie is really trying to say, okay, we paid homage to the older movies with Episode 7, but we still have these characters in Episode 8, so let's continue on their stories. Let's learn more about them. But we also have these other characters, and I think Rian Johnson does fall into the trap of he likes some of the characters that he was given from Episode 7 more than others. Specifically, he probably likes Rey more than Finn in terms of the direction that he sees that he can take their character. But overall, this film is messy. This film is silly at times, not in the good way either. It has some practical stuff that's a little out there. It has some ideas that I don't think a good amount of people are going to say, alright, that's a great idea. There's going to be confliction with this entire movie. But I think there's enough in this movie that really, not only for people who are expecting nothing of this film, but people who are expecting something of this film, when they go see it, I think they're going to get something good, maybe even very good out of this movie. Like I said, I want to pin this in. Mark Hamill, Daisy Ridley, and Adam Driver in this film are phenomenal. They're the reason you go to see this movie. Everything else, in terms of it being a Star Wars film, maybe it's not the best Star Wars film, but it's definitely an interesting movie. It's definitely an action-packed movie, and I'm not going to say it's the smartest movie in the world, but it makes you think. It makes you consider everything in the film, and it doesn't just give it to you on a platter. I would give this film. I have a end of year review coming up. I'll explain the rating system then. I'm giving this movie about an 8. As of right now, this might be one that after I think about it some more, I'm like, even from the time I came back to the theater and then I prepared something for this review, I'm starting to like this movie more. I'm starting to see some of the good things about this movie in more full view now that I've been able to kind of sit down and think about it for a while. But yeah, I think an 8 suits this movie very well. That's my review of The Last Jedi, Episode 8. Thank you for watching.